Thanks for tuning in, everyone, and welcome back. I know there's been a little bit of a delay since the most recent episode, and that's because I had a cross country move, and I also had a couple trips where we had to fly to Michigan for, and just a lot going on. So I appreciate the patience. That said, I've been working hard on content to prepare for everyone over the next few months in terms of retirement planning. And I wanted to kick off a series, with the topic being retirement planning, talking about the risks of retirement or risks in retirement, talking about that 4% rule, which actually is back in the media now in terms of 4% withdrawal rate out of your portfolio, talking about the differences between accumulating assets for retirement and the withdrawal stage for retirement. I'll talk about that in the second part. And then also talking about spending rules and how we can make portfolios last through any market conditions. And obviously we know right now that the S&P 500 is down 20 something percent in 2022 thus far. And also what's interesting is that government bonds are also down as rates go up, bond prices fall. And therefore bond ETFs, treasury ETFs, are down on the year. So it's really interesting because, a lot of people think bonds are safe or they might have preconceived notions regarding their investments. And it's important to discuss those and talk through those just to make sure that people have the understanding of what they're doing in their retirement plans and why that matters. So right now I have a plan for 3 different parts of this series. This is obviously part 1. And I really hope that everyone that's listening enjoys it, and because I put quite a bit of time into it, and I hope everyone likes it. Moving on to just hopping right into those risks in retirement. So retirement's interesting, right? You get one chance, right? You can't run different. I mean, you don't have redos is what I'm saying. So a lot of times when we do financial planning and use software, we use what's called a Monte Carlo analysis or a simulation where it looks at, thousands, 10,000, whatever the number is, of different scenarios for your retirement over time. You don't get that in reality, which is where we live. We live in the real world. You get one shot to make it work. So it's important to identify and know what the risks are that might be in your path as you navigate retirement. So I'm going to talk about some financial risks, and then also there's some non-financial risks and or areas to be aware of as you're planning retirement. First one, talking about tax risk. And so this is interesting because it's one we can't control, right? With risks, a lot of these we're unable to control, yet we still have to plan for them, which is important. So when we talk tax risk, there's a lot of different ways we could go with this, but mainly talking about should tax rates go up, right? We are in a historically low tax environment, and therefore a lot of planning that I'm doing right now with clients is we're estimating and guessing that, and I hate to use those words, but that's all we can do if we can't control it. We're estimating and projecting that tax rates have a probability to increase over the next 30 years of their retirement or 40 years or whatever the number is, because a lot of different factors, right? The interest rates rising, the national debt, financing different mechanisms like the Social Security bucket for the government. It's important to factor in how people's plans might be affected from a tax standpoint. So knowing that that's a risk, how do we plan for that? Well, there's ways that we can smooth out tax liability year over year. Things like Roth conversions or making sure that clients are prepared for what could potentially be Medicare surcharges, and I talked to a client yesterday about, your tax return at age 63 is what will determine your potential Medicare surcharge by the time you're 65. And then that reviews, and it's almost like a 2-year past looking mechanism basically that calculates what you'll pay for your Medicare premiums. So it's important to factor all these in. And as we know, financial planning is not just investment management, right? There's a lot more components to that. So tax risk, right? Making sure that we smooth out tax liability so that it can be relatively steady rather than ticking time bombs later, whether it's a required distribution on a large portfolio or just a major tax event that you might not be prepared for. So that's the first one, is tax risk. So moving on to the second one that's getting a ton of headlines right now, is inflation risk. So this is big, right? Inflation has historically been somewhere between, 2.5% to 3.5% long term. So that's what a lot of times we have been planning with, is using that 3% projection. Well, now we know we're in inflationary times, right? The federal government printed a ton of money, trillions of dollars, and by adding so much money to the money supply, that's just what happens, right? Inflation happens. So now, if you're in retirement and thinking through inflation risk, what are you able to do? Well, the easy answer, right, and it is hold assets that are hedged against inflation. Okay, well, right now in the markets, there's nowhere to hide. So actually, what's interesting is it's almost like cash is the best performing asset thus far in 2022. Obviously, we don't know how that will shake out for the rest of the year, but the easy answer is, we'll go toward assets that are not subject to inflation. Well, that's easier said than done. So now what? Well, chunks of money, $10,000 per year per social security number can be used toward I bonds, right? Series I bonds. And I have a podcast and a video on that are only available through Treasury Direct. And they're not available in IRAs and things. It has to just be cash. But then again, that's only $10,000 per year per social security number. Things like Treasury inflation protected securities, TIPS, right? That could be a mechanism. One asset class that has not been hurt thus far, right? We'll see how that goes with another risk, which is interest rates, is housing and mortgages. And mortgage rates are up for sure, but we haven't seen real estate prices come down yet. So inflation's really tricky right now in terms of how to plan for it. And I know I didn't give any really good ways to plan for it right now. But what we're doing with clients is just strategically rebalancing their portfolios and, making sure that we're stress testing and how would their plan be affected if inflation stays high for a long period of time, and what do we have to do and what can we build into their plan that we can control to mitigate that risk, whether it's, cutting expenses in other categories or, using cash right now while the market's down, even though, cash is getting used or cash is, technically losing money to inflation because bank interest rates have not caught up yet and savings accounts. It's a tough situation right now with inflation, but really the first thing we have to do is establish a benchmark and stress test. And then we can see how their plan would be affected should inflation stay high for the long term. It's really the best place to start. The next risk is a big one. It's healthcare and long-term care. So things that can derail a retirement plan are unexpected healthcare expenses. So if you have a pot of money in retirement, the classic example is if you've just had a taxable brokerage account and it had, whatever the number is, $1 million, let's say, and and you asked, is that liquid? Are you able to access that? Well, yeah, you can. But if you're also trying to gather an income stream from that portfolio, an unexpected healthcare event or something that would cause you to take out a lump sum, that would adversely affect that income stream that you we're taking from that portfolio. So therefore that money, in the most, natural sense is liquid, but if it's earmarked for income, it's technically not liquid in that sense, in that standpoint. So making sure that you have some type of plan for unexpected healthcare expenses and, Medicare, which isn't necessarily, there are a lot of options, but it's not necessarily rocket science. And just comparing, Medicare Advantage versus getting original and then adding a Medigap policy, those are things that you have to plan through. That said, long-term care insurance is a whole nother bear. And I shouldn't just say long-term care insurance, long-term care events, right? Meaning that you're unable to perform 2 out of 6 activities of daily living, which I don't know if I can name them off the top of my head, but bathing, eating, dressing, toileting, transferring, continence, I think are the 6. But if you're unable to perform 2 out of 6 of those, that could be considered a long-term care event. So how do you plan for that? And there's a lot of different ways, right? You can self-fund it and just pay out of assets. You could buy a standalone long-term care insurance policy, like, a use it or lose it policy. You could do some type of hybrid policy. And right now in the marketplace, they have policies that combo in life insurance and long-term care or annuities and long-term care as just a mechanism for you to fund that potential need later on in life or whenever that may occur. Or you can take some type of hybrid approach where you self-fund a portion of it and then have a sliver of long-term care insurance, whether it's a standalone or hybrid product. So it's a big thing. I mean, those are big risks for sure to think about. And knowing that healthcare inflation is separate from just normal inflation in terms of the percentage amount, it's kind of tough to plan for. And you really have to have that conversation. And it's not the most fun conversation to talk about, you not being able to eat or bathe or what have you, but it's important, right? And it can derail a financial plan. So having a plan for that is definitely key. And again, most of these this is the common theme. It starts with stress testing your plan and plugging in what would happen, should there be a long-term care event that costs $125,000 per year for however many years, and stress testing that. The next risk to talk about is looking at, so this will be the biggest one essentially, and I might spend the most time on it, is talking about market risk and sequence of returns risk. So I'm going to cover this more in part 2, but when you get to retirement, average returns do not matter. Average returns might matter while you're accumulating, but in the withdrawal stage, average returns don't matter. It's the order in which the returns happen. And there's a huge difference in retirement if you experience positive market returns in your first few years of retirement versus if you experience negative market returns in your first few years of retirement. So the sequence or order with which the market gives you the return is very, very important and tells a lot about whether or not that plan would be successful throughout a retirement's 30-year time period or 30-year or more time period. So what can we do for that? Well, the first step is making sure that we talk about the type of retiree that you are and your preferences and your style for retirement. I'm going to do pretty much a whole episode on this, so just talking about what style you have. And, just to give a little bit of a nugget now, some clients are more what we'd call safety first, and they might want some contractual guarantees inside of their retirement income plan to mitigate some of this market risk and hedge against downturns in the market. And other people might just be probability based. And that means that they are just more trusting of the market as using what we'd call a total return approach to fund their retirement long term. That said, the just sheer when you retire and what year and what return you get in your first few years of retirement has a huge effect. And the classic example and I will post a screenshot and a link to this, is just talking about, your return value in, and what order that those are received. And there's a video graphic, if you will, where it compares two investors, Bob and Ted, and each of them have a $500,000 account, and they're planning to take out 25,000 per year. Well, in the first 3 years of retirement, Bob gets positive 29% in year one, negative 6 in year two, positive 19 in year three. Well, Ted gets negative 10, negative 13, and negative 23 in his first few years of retirement. If we go all the way down to, and then if we go all the way down to year 19 or 20, by the time we get there, Bob, who had positive returns his first few years, still has the $500,000 in his account. But Ted, who had the negative returns in his first few years, is already out of money. So it's really, really interesting to look at that sequence or that order of returns. So people that are retiring in the next couple of years or just retired, it's important to discuss that plan and make sure that they have some assets that are not on that roller coaster of the market. And that doesn't mean necessarily you're holding it in cash. There's other avenues to do this, and that are hedged against the downside risk of the market. And it's really interesting. There's a lot of other ways to solve this for sure. But just thinking about an overall retirement plan, it's going to be key to have some level of either buffer assets or assets that are not invested to fund your retirement in years where the market's down. So specifically for clients right now, I always have, if they're in retirement, I always have a couple years worth of their income in shorter term assets, whether it's cash or a bond ladder or, some type of CD or some type of asset, right, where they are not subject to market losses, and we can utilize those funds to fund their retirement, which is what we're doing now. So sequence of return or order of returns risk is really, really big, really, really important, and something that it must be talked about because we're in interesting times, right? Inflation's high, interest rates were low, but now they're rising, and bonds have not been performing. And bonds have, traditionally been thought of as a safe haven and, something to hedge against losses in the stock market. Well, that hasn't been the case this year. So really making sure that you have a plan for that order of those returns in your portfolio is very, very key. The last one to talk about as far as financial risks go are what I call it a comfortable strategy and a risk to that. And so I'm going to talk a lot about this in part 2, but there's a classic rule called the 4% rule it's created by a guy named Bill Bengen. And basically that rule just states that an investor that holds a balanced portfolio of 50 to 70% stock and the rest in intermediate term treasury bonds can take 4% out of their portfolio per year, inflation adjust it, and never run out of money. Well, he actually came out in April and said that the market volatility has made it where he is now moving a lot of his money to safer assets. And what I mean by safer, I guess there's risk to every asset, but safer in the sense of less volatile. So he's de-risking his portfolio because he just can't handle it. So what I mean by comfortable strategy is that not everyone should have 100% or, 70% or 50% even of their assets in the stock market, where things can go down, especially those on either side of, 3 to 5 years ish of retirement, 3 to 5 years before retirement and first 3 to 5 years in retirement, because that might not be a strategy that they can stick with. You might not be able to say, yep, no matter what, we'll just leave it invested and just take out the 4% per year. Like that doesn't work for a lot of people. And back to that safety first versus probability based, that's a scale. And there are clients that I have that take a specific, well, I don't know if it's a survey or questionnaire, but it's specific to their retirement income style and where they fall on that spectrum. And that's important because you don't want, like I said at the beginning, you can't get a redo on this. You have to get it right the first time. And even if there is a suboptimal strategy in terms of mathematics that an investor might choose, it's more important to choose something that an investor can stick with. And that is the art and science of financial planning, which I've been talking about all year, is creating a strategy that an investor can stick with. All right, now moving on to non-financial risks. And so these are not as sexy. They're less written about in the media, but they're some of the most important. And really, I've seen these just, now being in the industry 10 years is looking at people who are in retirement and how they feel now. And it's a huge shift from, going to work and hanging out with your colleagues or, friends at work or what have you, to now just being retired, right? And the goal, it might sound awesome that every day is a Saturday, but there's a lot of non-financial risks to think about as well. And the first one of that is just boredom, right? If I asked my in-laws this when I saw them last, but like I asked, what do you think is the number one activity or hobby that retirees do? And it's watch TV. And we all know how that can go, especially with where media sits today on, any side of the spectrum you land politically. There's just a lot of misinformation, and I've called it misinformation for profit. And it's all over the board, whether it's financial news or what have you. It's just a lot of garbage TV. And so people being bored in retirement is a huge non-financial risk that I guess could potentially lead to being a financial risk. But being bored it's not good for your physical health or your cognitive health. And you have to have different hobbies. And leading into the next one, which is lack of purpose and fulfillment, you have to do things in life that give you purpose and give you fulfillment. Otherwise, retirement is not fun. And people find themselves being lonely and, being bored. So things to think about there is what would a retirement look like? And the third one is in terms of non-financial risks is talking about just their social circle. And that's why these retirement communities exist, is to have a social circle where a lot of people have the same hobbies and they hang out together. It's really interesting. I was listening to, I don't know if it was a YouTube video or a podcast, but talking about how when you grow up and you're a kid, you just have, you have your social circle, you have friends, and you don't really have too many worries in life, and you just get along and hang out every day and play games, ride bikes, what have you. Then you go to work, the next phase of life, right? School, work. But then you get to retirement and it's kind of like you have the ability to be a kid again and hang out with friends all the time that have the same hobbies, and you have a social circle. And socializing with people, keeping your brain sharp, keeping your physical health sharp is very key for a long life, right? You don't want to work 40 years of your life and save a bunch of money and have a great nest egg to then be super bored and have no purpose and no social circle in retirement. So those are just all keys in terms of non-financial risks that people should think about. Now, going back to what I said at the beginning about you're not, and in the middle, where you're not able to get a redo on this. And so it's important that you build out a plan, a baseline plan, and then stress test it, right? There's software out there, whether it's financial planners, a software that I might use with clients, or just anything that you can think of that builds out, you could probably do some of it in Excel to build out, the stress test ability. and talking about, okay, what if taxes went up? What if inflation increases or stays high for long? What if you live to be 110 years old? What if the market, doesn't get back to all-time highs for 3 years? And build out those strategies to look at, okay, worst case, here's where you're at today, and then go from there and just keep building that out and using software to do it. Now, that's not the be all end all, right? Like I said, you have to blend in the art and science of planning. But as you can see, based on all the risks that I've talked about, right? Sequence or order of returns risk, tax risk, inflation risk, healthcare and long-term care, having a strategy that you can actually stick to, being bored in retirement, lack of purpose, having a social circle in retirement. Those are all things to think about. And so there's a lot more to your overall plan than just, hey, what did the stock market do yesterday? I'll leave everything here. I hope this was helpful. Again, listing out all the risks. I will go ahead and also post that sequence of returns visual. It's from an annuity company, but it's the same idea. Basically, what they did was they had returns, going A to Z in terms of over 20 years, and then they had the same exact returns flip flop. We'll call it Z to A, for investor number 2. And it's wild because over a 20-year period, their return was exactly the same, but it matters what returns took place when. I hope you enjoyed listening. This was part 1. The next part 2, we'll be talking about that 4% rule, which I mentioned in the beginning, and then how planning is different between pre and post-retirement. If you like the podcast, feel free to go ahead and leave a review on your favorite medium that you listen to the pod on, and we will catch everyone next time. Thanks so much.